The night the rooftop held its breath, skyline terrace floated above the city like a quiet ship at sea, its glass railing catching the dying light and returning it as soft fire along the rim. The elevator opened to the smell of rosemary and chard, lemon to low jazz that never tried too hard, to the sound of forks that sounded like rain on old windows. Naomi Carter stepped out before the doors had fully opened. Because she had timed this ride so often, she knew the exact moment to shift her weight and slide into the room. She moved as if the floor had been measured to her stride, a steady 12 paces to the host stand to check the reservation grid, 9 paces to the bar to greet Elias with a nod and confirm the stock of the Alberico, 7 to the back hallway, where the bussers stacked their folded linens in tight white towers. She took it all in without letting it show in her face. The tiny paste smear of béarnaise on the pass, the water pitcher left at half, the too bright candle at table 14 that would glare in a guest's eyes if no one turned it down. She fixed the candle, refilled the pitcher, wiped the pass with a quick flick, then tied her apron and breathed in. Up here the city sounded far away, almost kind, like a memory you could stand beside without pain. She loved it for that. Loved that, after a day of numbers in her head, and a bus ride that rattled like a box of pennies, and a text from her landlord reminding her of the second Friday, she could step into a room that asked for grace and order and gave her a reason to be precise. Naomi's hands moved like a metronome. Wipe, set, pour, check, smile, step. And beneath the tempo her thoughts kept a promise she'd made to herself long ago, that she would never shrink to fit inside someone else's comfort again. The room filled the way it always did on a clear night. First the couple who took the corner beneath the hanging garden, then the 3 friends who laughed with their whole shoulders, then the quiet table of 2 in suits who arrived with a negotiation stitched into their silence. Naomi greeted them all with that calm tone people understand without thinking about it. Welcome, you're seen. You're safe to enjoy this. When she described the night's special citrus brine chicken with fennel pollen and a glaze that tasted like a sunset had melted on the tongue, people leaned forward as if they could already taste it. She kept notes in her head the way other people kept playlists. The woman with the soft scarf was allergic to pistachio. The man with the tired eyes would brighten with a story about the chef's childhood garden. The student by the railing was counting dollars in his mind and could use a suggestion that would feel looks without stealing a week's groceries. Her voice never rose above the music, but it carried wherever it needed. Elias caught her eye from the pass and tilted his chin toward a tray of amuse-bouches. She swept them up and slipped back into the tide of the room. Then the elevator opened again, and the air gathered itself as if it knew a storm had stepped. Inside, wearing the shape of a man, Victor Kane did not enter so much as alter the temperature of the space he entered. He was not loud. He never had to be. Money can be quiet and still make a crowd bend like grass. He wore a suit the shade of new ash and a tie that was almost playful. A narrow strip of blue dotted with pinhead silver that said he enjoyed pretending he could be casual. At his side came 2 aides like punctuation, the kind you notice only after the sentence cuts you. Sophia looked up from the podium and her hand brushed a single button on the reservation screen, even though she knew everyone knew he didn't. Wait. He scanned the room with eyes that didn't land, the way a hawk looks not at a field but through it. A busser froze with a basket of bread, and Naomi took it from his hands without breaking her stride, because fear was a smell and she would not let it spread. She reached the host stand just as Victor reached the first table. "Good evening, Mr. Kane," she said, and the sound of her voice was ordinary on purpose. "Not cold, not warm, just the temperature of the glass in a steady hand?" "We have a table prepared." He didn't answer, but he accepted the space she made for him the way arrogant men accept air. She led him to a foretop against the city, the kind of view that forgives a day. He didn't look at the skyline. He looked at the chairs as if deciding whether they deserved him. He sat. 1 aide sat. The other remained standing, tapping the phone like a tiny war drum. Naomi set down water with a slice of cucumber that had been cut thin enough to feel like a secret, and when she reached for the wine list, he said, "I'll need someone who knows what they're doing tonight." He did not say please. He did not look at her. She did not flinch. You have me, she said. That will be enough. He tested her at once, the way men who collect buildings sometimes test the mortar looking for fault. We'll begin with a Barolo, he said, but not young and not the bottle you suggest to tourists. Naomi let a half-breath pass before. She spoke because it made her thoughts sharper and also because it made other people wonder who was in control. How do you feel about a 2010 from Serralonga de Alba, she said, as if she were offering a hand instead of knowledge. Dense tannins that relax after 10 minutes, tar and rose, perfect for the bone marrow course if you're open to it. He looked up then, just a fraction. It is a small thing to be genuinely seen by a person who thinks he owns rooms. Her spine stayed tall. And if I don't want to wait 10 minutes? He asked. Naomi's mind stepped sideways to the cellar map she knew like street names. Then I'd bring a 2013 that opens faster. It's not as deep, but it greets you instead of making you chase it. She knew before he smiled that he would say something cutting, because when you corner a man who lives on advantage, he remembers the tools he trusts. Do you recite label copy at home, he murmured, or only for tips? And the table behind Naomi hushed without meaning to. Sophia's eyes flicked up and Elias put both hands flat on the pass as if to steady the room. Naomi lifted the wine list and set it down in a way that said nothing of her heartbeat. I do not recite, she said, and her voice stayed level. Like a line on a monitor that proves life, I study. If you prefer a different server, I'll bring one now. But you will not insult my integrity in this room. The age shifted as if paper had moved under him. Victor did not blink. He let silence build brick by brick because he believed he owned silence too. Naomi did not fill it. She had learned long ago that some silences are mirrors you hold up, until a man sees himself looking small. When she finally turned to fetch the bottle, the city threw a long band of light across the table, and in it his knuckles looked older than his eyes. In the kitchen, the air was hot with butter and the hiss of deglaze, with the soft language of cooks who speak in questions that are really assurances. Elias was already holding the 2010 when she slipped through the swinging door. You want decant? He asked, and it was not a question because he had watched the room change and knew exactly why. Yes, she said, and then, quiet but steady. He tried the old thing, Elias snorted. The old thing is tired in this house. He set the decanter on a linen that used to be his grandmother's and nodded at the line. 2 marrow to 7, plus his usual bravado. Naomi smiled with one corner of her mouth. Bravado pairs well with salt, she said. She watched the wine fold into the decanter like a ribbon disappearing into dark water, and she felt her pulse match the pour until the world narrowed to the crimson line and the glass and the knowledge that dignity is a craft as real as cooking. She lifted the tray and stepped back out, and for a moment the music caught her just so, upright bass walking slow, piano tracing a polite curve, and she almost laughed at how simple it could be to stand once. You decided that you would never kneel. She reached the table with the decanter as if she had been born with it in her hand. It will open, she said, even if the night does not. Victor's mouth twitched, the way a man's does when near the end of the second course, a small thing happened that told Naomi everything about the night. The standing aide thin, quick, carrying the smell of too much cologne and old ambition tried to hand her his empty glass while she was lifting the entree plate for the seated aide. It was meant to force a drop, to force a failure, a test inside the test. Naomi did not step back. She did not consider a speech about manners. She adjusted her elbow by a breath's width, took the empty with a curl of her last 2 fingers, set it on the tray without looking, and lowered the entree to the table in a smooth, slow arc that ended with the meat resting exactly where the knife would want it. When she straightened, her eyes met the aide's. She said nothing. He looked away. Victor saw the whole thing and hid his reaction by pretending the skyline had finally caught his attention. In the hiding, she glimpsed something she recognized. Not with her mind, but with a place in her chest that had learned to read people the way sailors read wind. It was not respect yet. Respect is a plant with a long root. It was something like surprise at the boundary of curiosity. And curiosity, she knew, is the first time a wall asks itself whether a door would be useful, all through this. Naomi's own life threaded itself through the service the way a thin gold seam runs under a painting and makes it glow if you know where to look. Every time she set a fork, she remembered the morning her brother Michael texted a photo of his acceptance letter and how her hands shook so hard she spilled coffee on the crumbly tile and didn't care. Every time she twisted a bottle in her palm so the label faced exactly toward the guest, she saw her landlord's reminder pinned to the corkboard by her fridge and felt the tiny stone of worry that lived in her stomach soften. This shift would cover it, and the next, and the next, and one day she would not need to count nights to count hope. The city glimmered like a patient animal, and when the wind tugged the potted lavender near the railing, the scent followed her and braided itself into her words. She thought of the promise she had made to herself at 19 after a manager called her girl in a voice that sounded like a laugh and a leash, and how she went home that night and said out loud to the dark, "I will learn enough to be unshakable, and I will love enough to be kind." The unshakable part had taken years and books and quiet practice. The loving part took the rest of her life. Every day, a new desert service arrived like a cooling of the blood. Espresso custards with a char that cracked under the spoon, a pear tart glazed to a mirror, a bitter chocolate torte that tasted like thunder rolling away. Victor said he didn't eat sugar. Then he ate half the torte. He said the espresso was lukewarm. It wasn't. He said the city was dying. It wasn't. He said he missed the time when restaurants knew their place. Naomi smiled without showing teeth and asked if he would like the check. He did not answer for a moment. The wind lifted the edge of the tablecloth and laid it back down like a hand smoothing a child's hair. He tapped the bill with a finger that wore no ring. "You don't bend," he said, not to her exactly, more to the air, as if naming a weather pattern. "I bend for the right weather," she said. "I do not break for storms that only want to see me fall." The aide who had tried to trick her raised his eyebrows at the phrasing, because even he could hear when a sentence lands with a key in it. Victor slid a card across the table as if he were conceding a game he hadn't known he was playing. Naomi took it, returned with the receipt, and set down a pen that had never failed to write. He signed without looking up. Then he looked up. "You'll serve me again," he said, and this time it was not threat or promise, only a statement from a man who had finally met something he could not buy. "I will serve this room again," Naomi answered. "If you're in it, I'll serve you too. But you'll leave here knowing respect is the dress code." He stared at her as if the city had gone silent or the earth had tilted. Then he stood. The chair legs made the sound of a small decision. He left without his usual parting joke that made people feel small for clapping. The elevator closed. The jazz kept playing. And only then did the rooftop exhale after the last guest drifted into the cooled night, and the bussers turned the glassware into small constellations. Naomi leaned her hips against the bar and let her shoulders drop for the first time in hours. Elias slid her a small porcelain cup. "Not sugar," he said, "but sweet." Inside was a macerated strawberry he saved for himself on long nights and now saved for her. She ate it and looked down at her hands, which had set so many plates and steadied so many moments and carried, without complaint, the weight of other people's moods. "He'll be back," Sophia said, appearing with the closing folder like a book of prayers. "He always returns to the stage." Naomi didn't answer right away. She watched the small wind move the lavender again. She thought of Michael studying in the library where the air smelled like every book that had ever forgiven a mistake. She thought of the way Victor had almost smiled at his own surprise. "If he comes back," she said, finally, "he'll find me here, the same height." She untied her apron, folded it into a neat square, and placed it beside the register as if placing a day gently to sleep. The elevator chimed again, just a busser who had forgotten a foam, but for a breath the room held that suspended feeling. That comes before a second act. Naomi gathered her bag, said good night, and walked to the stairwell with the tired grace of someone who has earned her rest. On the landing, she paused, looked back at the tables aligned like patient chess pieces, and let herself feel proud in the simple, durable way pride belongs to people who have done the work when no one watched. Then she took the stairs down into the city that was waiting, not with fireworks or sirens, but with the steady truth that tomorrow would ask the same question: will you stand tall? And she already knew the answer, the return of the storm the first time Victor Kane had walked into Skyline Terrace. Naomi had learned something about him. He carried his arrogance like a second skin. Not as an act, but as a habit so deeply woven into him that he didn't notice when it scraped against people. The second time, however, she was about to learn something else. Habits aren't always armor. Sometimes they're just a way to keep the world from getting too close. 3 days had passed since that evening where the rooftop seemed to hold its breath in rhythm with her pulse. Naomi had spent those days in a kind of quiet alertness. She did her shifts with her usual precision, but she could feel the subtle ripple his presence had left behind. Staff members whispered about her in the back hallways, not in cruelty, but in that incredulous way people speak about someone who has done something they thought was impossible. Sophia had told her flatly on Tuesday morning, "You do realize he's blacklisted chefs, managers, and entire hotels for less than what you said to him." Naomi's only reply had been a shrug and the quiet, "Then maybe they needed someone to test them." By Friday evening, the rooftop was alive again. The gold wash of sunset painted the glass tables and turned every wine bottle into a jewel. Naomi was in the middle of explaining to a honeymoon couple why their halibut would arrive with a preserved lemon relish when she caught sight of the elevator doors sliding open. That same subtle shift in air, like a room instinctively inhaling, spread. Across Skyline Terrace, Victor Kane was back. This time he wore a charcoal suit that seemed to drink in the fading light, and there was no entourage. Just him, a folded leather portfolio under one arm, his gaze scanning the room not in dominance, but with the precise calm of someone checking the perimeter. Sophia, at the host stand, looked at Naomi for guidance. Naomi didn't hesitate. She crossed the floor with the same steady stride as before, no rush, no hesitation, as if the fact of his return was as routine as the arrival of the first star over the skyline. "Good evening, Mr. Kane," she said, her tone balanced so perfectly between formality and familiarity that it couldn't be mistaken for fear. He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "You're still here." It wasn't said as a greeting, more like an observation he was trying to understand. "I am," she replied simply. She led him to the same table, his table now, though she'd never admit it out loud. As she set the menu in front of him, he didn't pick it up. Instead, he leaned back, watching her in the way a man watches a chessboard after an unexpected move. "Do you recommend the same wine as before?" he asked finally. "Or do you know something better for me tonight?" It was the kind of question meant to test, and she answered as if it were the most natural conversation in the world. "That depends, Mr. Kane. Are you in the mood for something that challenges you or something that comforts you?" His brows ticked upward at the choice of words. "Challenges me," he said after a beat, "always." Naomi suggested a smoky Syrah from the northern rain, rich with dark fruit. They went through the meal in a rhythm neither of them had anticipated. He ordered sea bass with saffron butter. She paired it with a Gruner Veltliner chilled just enough to draw out the citrus in the dish. When the base arrived, he didn't test her with unnecessary returns or invented complaints. Instead, he asked questions about the fish's source, the chef's technique, even the history of the wine region. Naomi answered each one without pretension, her voice carrying that steady warmth that never slipped into obsequiousness. From a nearby table, Grace Holloway, though unknown to Naomi, watched closely. The critic's pen moved quietly against her leather-bound journal, her sharp eyes taking in every interaction, every gesture. Grace had built a career on exposing pretenders in the service industry, but she had also written her most lauded pieces about rare moments of genuine dignity between guest and staff. Tonight, she sensed she might be witnessing one. When Victor finished his meal, he didn't immediately rise. Instead, he placed his fork down, sat back, and regarded her. "I have a reputation," he said matter-of-factly. "I'm aware." Naomi replied, her voice neither admiring nor condemning. "People tend to treat me according to what they've heard," he continued. "And you?" Naomi folded her hands behind her back. "I treat people according to what they show me." There was a stillness between them then, the kind of stillness that feels like both a question and an answer. Victor reached into his jacket and pulled out his card, sliding it across the table. "Surprise me next time," he said. And without another word, he left. The skyline reflected in the glass where his wine had been, as if the city itself had been listening when the elevator doors closed. Naomi stood for a moment with her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table. She didn't know whether his challenge was a threat, an invitation, or both. But she did know one thing. The next time he walked into Skyline Terrace, she would be ready not to match his power, but to meet it without bending. And that, she thought as she cleared his glass, was the only real surprise a man like him could never buy, the high stakes. The evening of the charity gala arrived draped in the kind of nervous anticipation that seeped into the walls long before the first guest stepped onto the rooftop. Skyline Terrace had been transformed from its usual understated elegance into something richer. Almost ceremonial towering floral arrangements of white orchids and calla stood sentinel at the corners of the dining room, while the linen-clad tables glimmered under the weight of crystal and polished silver. Naomi Carter arrived 2 hours before her shift, not because she needed to, but because she knew nights like this were never as smooth as they looked from the outside. She tied her apron with practiced precision, smoothed the fabric down over her hips, and checked the seating chart Elias had taped to the pass. A quick scan told her everything she needed to know. Victor Kane was coming, and he was not coming alone. His name sat in bold black ink at the center of table 4. Alongside other names Naomi recognized from the local business columns: bankers, developers, people who could purchase silence as easily as they purchased wine. The air in the kitchen was already humming with the rhythm of prep. Elias, sleeves rolled to the elbow, barked out instructions to the line cooks while spooning a reduction over a tray of roasted quail. Sophia, clipboard in hand, moved like a conductor between the front and back of house, calling adjustments, checking the polish on glassware, and coordinating with the florist who was fussing over a stubborn arrangement near the entry. Naomi approached her between tasks, scanning the guest list once more. "Table 4, she said quietly, tapping the page. "I assume you've heard?" Sophia's expression was half a grimace, half a smirk. "He's bringing donors, so he'll want to be the center of gravity. Just keep your footing." Naomi didn't bother responding. Her footing wasn't the problem. It was his tendency to test whether she could be knocked off it. By the time the sun had dissolved into the horizon and the first guests arrived, the room had settled into that polite buzz unique to high-profile events. Soft laughter rolled in from the balcony, the band's strings sighed under a jazz standard, and every surface gleamed under the warm wash of candlelight. Naomi moved between tables like she was tracing lines in a painting, her steps unhurried but efficient, her gaze catching details others missed: a wine glass faintly smudged before a guest even noticed, a candle guttering in the breeze that needed shielding, the subtle shift in posture. When someone was ready to order but didn't want to wave for attention, then, at precisely 7:15, the elevator doors opened and Victor Kane stepped out as though he were walking into a boardroom he already owned. This time, he wore a midnight blue suit that seemed to drink the light around him, a silk pocket square the color of deep wine folded sharply at his breast. Flanking him were 2 men and a woman, all dressed in the expensive, understated style of people accustomed to power. Conversations faltered across the room as the group approached table 4, not because they were loud, but because their presence seemed to pull the air toward them. Naomi was already on her way, wine list in hand, her voice level when she greeted him. "Good evening, Mr. Kane. Welcome to Skyline Terrace. May I begin by recommending an opening pour?" Victor's eyes moved over, and for a moment she let the noise of the dining room fade. Somewhere behind her, Grace Holloway closed her notebook and rose from her table, her expression unreadable. Naomi didn't see her leave, but she had the distinct sense that whatever had been written in that notebook tonight would carry her name and, perhaps, in some way, change what Skyline Terrace meant to the people who came here. And as for Victor Kane, he left without the grand exit people expected from him. No lingering handshakes, no parting jab, no dramatic toast. Just a nod to Naomi as he passed, the kind of nod that says, "I'll be back in next time. I won't be the only one watching." The cracks in the armor the following Friday began with a sky the color of wet slate and a breeze that carried the faint smell of rain off the harbor. From the moment Naomi stepped into Skyline Terrace through the staff entrance, she could feel that peculiar tension that hung in the air before a major evening, different from the charity gala, different from the night of her first encounter with Victor Kane. This was quieter, but more dangerous. Sophia was already at the host stand, tapping her pen against the reservation ledger with a rhythm that betrayed her nerves. When Naomi approached, Sophia's voice dropped. "He's booked a private dinner. No entourage this time, just 3 guests. One of them is a city councilman, and the other 2 are names Elias muttered like they belonged on marble plaques." Naomi didn't ask for details. She'd learned that knowing too much about the social chessboard could be as distracting as knowing too little. What mattered was the table, the wine, the food, and the fact that tonight, if Victor wanted to test her, he'd be doing it in front of people who could bend the city's will with a phone call. In the kitchen, Elias was inspecting a delivery of halibut with his usual precision, running a thumb along the fillet as if reading Braille. "You've got him again?" he asked without looking up. Naomi nodded, fastening her apron. "Good," Elias said simply. "Better you than anyone else tonight." The comment carried the weight of unspoken trust, the kind that can't be faked. She checked the stemware for clouding, walked the perimeter of the dining room to adjust a candle here, a fold of linen there, then paused at the far end of the room where the glass wall framed the city. Lights were already winking on below, tiny beacons in the growing dusk. Naomi stood there for a moment, centering herself in the reflection, the same uniform, the same steady posture, but with something new in her eyes. Not defiance, not even confidence, but a readiness that came from knowing she had been here before and had not been moved. By 7:05, the elevator doors slid open and Victor Kane stepped out in a tailored black suit with a lapel pin, so understated it could only have been expensive. Behind him came the city councilman, a tall man with a voice that carried even when he wasn't speaking, and 2 women whose quiet poise suggested power not flaunted but assumed. Victor's greeting to Naomi was brief, but there was something different in the way his gaze held hers, less a challenge, more an acknowledgement, like a chess player nodding to a rival before the first move. "The same table?" she asked. "The only table," he replied, and for the first time since she'd met him, there was the faintest flicker of humor in his tone. She began with an offering of champagne, not the predictable Dom Perignon the councilman might have expected, but a smaller grower's vintage from the Montagne de Reims, crisp and mineral, with a sharpness that cut clean through the palate. Victor's eyebrow lifted as she poured. "You didn't go for the safe choice," he remarked. "Neither did you, inviting them," she replied, indicating his guests with the smallest tilt of her head. The corner of his mouth twitched, but he said nothing. Through the first 2 courses, Naomi moved like a conductor in a symphony she knew by heart. The councilman was decisive, ordering the roast venison. The women chose the sea bass with fennel puree. Victor took her recommendation for the duck breast, glazed with orange and star anise, paired with a silky 2014 Pinot Noir from Oregon. He asked questions about the wine that went deeper than usual, about the soil, the altitude, the way the vintage had developed over time. For the first time, Naomi sensed genuine curiosity beneath the surface of his inquiries, and she answered in kind, speaking not as a server but as someone who had studied enough to understand the story behind the bottle. The mood shifted just as the main courses were being cleared. A man appeared at the elevator, a late arrival in a tailored suit, younger than Victor, but with the same air of controlled authority. He crossed the floor quickly, clasping Victor's shoulder in greeting before slipping into an empty chair at the table. Naomi caught the subtle tightening in Victor's posture. "Didn't expect to see you here tonight," Victor said flatly. The man Naomi caught his name as Avery smiled in that polite, dangerous way that said he had come with purpose. "Wouldn't miss it. Heard you were holding court without the usual audience." The exchange was light on the surface, but the tension between them was immediate and sharp, like two wires sparking beneath a polished floor. As Naomi poured Avery a glass of the Pinot, she felt the weight of 4 pairs of eyes on her, waiting to see how she would handle the shift in atmosphere. She poured without haste, letting the wine catch the candlelight before setting the bottle down gently. "Mr. Kane selected this himself," she said, meeting Avery's gaze just long enough to shift it back to Victor. The implication that this was Victor's table. Victor's choice hung in the air like a quiet line drawn on a map. It was during the cheese course that the conversation turned, almost inevitably, to politics. The councilman began speaking about zoning changes. Victor countered with the realities of development costs, and Avery interjected with a pointed remark about people who build walls instead of communities. Naomi moved between tables, refilling glasses and clearing plates with the same unshaken composure she had kept from the beginning, but she was listening. The words between Victor and Avery sharpened, their civility fraying. Then, as if on cue, Avery leaned back in his chair and looked at Naomi. "Tell me," he said, voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of the nearby tables. "Do you prefer working for men who own the city or men who change it?" The question was a trap aimed at embarrassing Victor, baiting Naomi into taking a side in front of his guests. The room quieted. Naomi set the water jug down and straightened, not rushing her answer. "I prefer working for people who understand that ownership and change aren't the same thing as respect," she said evenly. "Respect is the one thing that makes every table worth serving." The councilman smiled faintly. The women exchanged glances, and even Avery looked momentarily caught off guard. Victor, for his part, simply held her gaze for a long moment before nodding once. Almost imperceptibly, dessert was served without further provocation, though the air between Victor and Avery still hummed with unfinished business. When the final plates were cleared and the guests began to rise, Victor lingered at the table. As Naomi gathered the last of the glasses, he said quietly, "Most people don't speak in my defense, even indirectly. You did." She met his eyes. "I spoke in defense of the table," she said. "The people at it are just part of the setting." He gave a short, quiet laugh, unexpected, almost disbelieving, and shook his head. "You're a dangerous woman, Naomi Carter." She didn't smile, but her voice carried the faintest warmth when she answered, "Only to men who think danger is the same thing as being seen." He left with his guests, the elevator doors closing softly behind them, and for a moment the rooftop felt like it had been reset. The storm passed, but the scent of it lingering in the air. In the kitchen, Elias leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "What did you say to him?" he asked. Naomi untied her apron, folding it neatly before answering. "Nothing I wouldn't say to anyone else." But as she walked out into the rain-slick night, she knew it wasn't entirely true. She had said exactly what Victor Kane needed to hear, whether he realized it yet or not. The breaking point, the rain had rolled in heavy over the harbor by the time Naomi stepped off the evening bus. The city's lights blurred into gold and white streaks on the wet pavement. The air had that damp chill that seeps through even the thickest coat, but it wasn't the weather that made her shoulders tighten as she approached Skyline Terrace. It was the note clipped to the staff bulletin board. "Table 4, Kane, 7:30 p.m., no extra names, no event, no gala. Just him." Sophia looked up from the host stand when Naomi came in, her face an unreadable mask. "He's in a mood," she murmured. "Got wind from the bartender at the Harbor Club some investment deal fell through this afternoon. Big one. He's been taking calls all day, and apparently none of them ended with good news." Naomi didn't bother asking for details. She'd seen enough men try to bleed their bad days into the people around them to know this would be one of those nights where every word and every silence would matter. In the kitchen, Elias was moving with an extra edge to his usual precision, inspecting the evening's menu as though it were a defensive playbook. "He's already called twice to confirm his reservation," he said without looking up. "That means he's restless. Restless people pick fights in rooms they think they control." Naomi was checking stemware for cloudiness, but she glanced at Elias and caught the flicker of something like concern in his expression. "You don't have to take him tonight," he said quietly. I'll move him to Daniel's section. She shook her head. I'm fine. Elias's jaw worked for a moment before he nodded. Then at least make him work for every reaction he's hoping to get. By the time the elevator doors opened, the dining room was already half full, couples leaning close over candlelight, the low murmur of conversation mixing with the sound of rain tapping softly against the glass. Victor Kane stepped out alone, without an overcoat despite the weather, his suit a deep graphite that caught every shadow. His pace was measured but heavy, the kind of walk that announced he was carrying something in his head he couldn't yet put down. He didn't look toward the skyline. He didn't even glance at the other tables. His eyes were fixed on the table Naomi was already setting. She greeted him as she always did, calm, direct, without deference. Good evening, Mr. Kane. He gave her a curt nod, dropped into his seat, and reached for the menu without meeting her gaze. She noticed the way his fingers gripped the edge of the leather as if it were a lifeline. Wine, he said shortly. Something strong. No fruit, no sweetness? She considered him for half a second longer than she usually would before answering. A Cabernet Sauvignon from Napa, she suggested. 2012 vintage, aged in French. Oak dry, structured, with enough weight to match the mood of the evening. His eyes flicked up, sharp, and for a moment she thought he might snap at her for the observation in her tone. Instead, he just said, Fine. Through the first Corsa roasted beet salad with chaver and walnut oil, Victor barely spoke. His phone buzzed twice in his pocket. Both times, he silenced it without looking. Naomi poured the wine with the same precision she always used, but she felt the pressure building like a wire slowly winding tighter. When she placed his main course in front of him, a grilled ribeye with rosemary butter, he finally spoke, his voice low but edged. Do you know how many people would give anything to sit at this table with me? She met his gaze evenly. Probably many. But tonight, it's just you and the steak. A faint murmur of laughter rippled from the nearby table, which only seemed to harden the line of his jaw. He set down his fork, leaning back in his chair. You think you're untouchable because you stand here with that calm face, correcting my wine, my choices, my manners. But this room belongs to people like me, not to people like you. There was the strike she'd been waiting for all evening. Around them, the conversations dimmed as guests instinctively sensed a shift. Naomi placed her hands lightly on the back of the empty chair across from him, grounding herself before she spoke. This room belongs to everyone who steps into it. Expecting respect, she said. And it stays theirs as long as they give it in return. His laugh was sharp, humorless. Respect is bought, Naomi. Everything is bought. That's how the world works. She didn't move, didn't blink. Then I must live in a different world, she said quietly. The stillness between them was almost physical, the tension stretching across the linen like a taut rope. For a moment she thought he might push it further, raise his voice, use her as a vent for whatever frustration was eating at him, but then something shifted, his shoulders lowered a fraction. His gaze dropped to the untouched glass of wine in front of him, when he finally spoke. His voice was quieter, stripped of some of the sharpness. My father used to say that too, about a different world. He died owing more money than he had. He picked up the glass, swirling the wine slowly. I told myself I'd never be at the mercy of anyone again, and I've kept that promise. Even if it means being the man everyone hates. Naomi stood still, letting the weight of the confession sit between them. Maybe, she said finally, but being hated and being strong aren't the same thing. Before he could respond, the elevator chimed and the doors opened onto an unexpected disruption. A tall man in a rain-darkened coat strode in, scanning the room until his eyes landed on Victor. You cost me the contract, Kane, the man said, his voice carrying across the dining room. You think you can hide up here and sip wine while people clean up your mess? The room froze. Naomi instinctively stepped half a pace to the side of Victor's chair, not in defense of him, but in defense of the dining room's fragile balance. Sir, she said to the man, her tone low but firm, you're welcome to speak with Mr. Kane, but not in a way that disrupts the other guests. The man ignored her, leaning forward on the table. You play king in these glass towers, but Your empire's cracking. Victor's face had gone very still, and Naomi saw it just for a second, the flash of vulnerability he usually kept buried under layers of control. She touched the edge of the man's sleeve lightly, guiding his gaze toward the side exit. "This isn't the place," she said. Something in her steadiness must have reached him, because after a tense pause, he turned and walked out without another word. When the doors closed again, Victor let out a slow breath and looked at her. "You didn't have to step in." Naomi collected his empty plate, her voice measured. "I didn't step in for you. I stepped in for the room. No one gets to burn it down on my watch." For the first time that night, a faint, almost reluctant smile touched his mouth. "Dangerous woman," he murmured. "You keep saying that," she replied, "as if I'll take it as an insult." He left not long after, without finishing his wine. But as Naomi watched the rain-slick city from the balcony during cleanup, she knew something had shifted. The breaking point had come and gone, and neither of them had walked away untouched. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be the same game they'd been playing since the night they first met. Respect on the rooftop the following week began with a string of soft, rain-washed mornings and a kind of fragile calm inside Skyline Terrace. The charity crowd had come and gone, the holiday weekend rush was still days away, and the regulars filled the room with the quiet ease of people who felt they belonged. Naomi noticed the difference in her own body, her shoulders looser, her breath slower between tables, but she also noticed something else. Victor Kane hadn't appeared since the night of the confrontation. Not on the reservation list, not slipping in unannounced. She told herself she didn't care one way or the other, but the truth was, his absence left an odd echo in the room, as though the space he usually occupied at table 4 was holding its breath. It was just past 6 on a Thursday when the echo broke. The elevator doors opened, and there he was alone again, but not in the storm armor of their last meeting. His suit was a lighter gray, the knot of his tie just slightly imperfect. And there was a quality to his expression Naomi had not seen before. He paused at the threshold for a heartbeat, scanning the room, then made his way to her station without waiting for the host. She didn't rush to meet him. She finished setting a bottle of sparkling water on another table, smiled at the couple seated there, and only then walked toward him with the same steady stride she had used the first night they met. "Good evening, Mr. Kane," she said, her voice even but softer than it had been in weeks. He nodded in return, but there was no flash of challenge in his eyes, no tightness in his jaw. "Is your table available?" he asked, and she noticed the difference, the question instead of the assumption. "It is," she replied, leading him there. He didn't sit immediately. Instead, he stood for a moment looking out over the harbor, where the fading light had turned the water into a sheet of dark silver. "You get this view every night," he said quietly, "and yet you still notice it." When he finally sat, he didn't pick up the menu. "I'll take whatever you recommend," he said. "No conditions, no qualifiers." She considered him for a moment before suggesting the halibut in a saffron cream with spring vegetables, paired with a Chablis Premier Cru clean, mineral, and bright enough to lift the richness of the sauce. He nodded without hesitation. When she returned with the wine, she noticed his hands were still, resting loosely on the linen, his phone nowhere in sight. The first course came and went in near silence, but it wasn't the tense silence of their earlier encounters. This was easier, slower, as though both of them had put down invisible weapons. When Naomi cleared the plate, he spoke without looking up. "You know, I've been called a lot of things in this city, ruthless, arrogant, dangerous. They're not wrong. But last week," he stopped, searching for the right words. "Last week, when you told that man, 'No one gets to burn this room down on your watch,' I realized something. You weren't talking about me, but you weren't protecting me either. You were protecting something bigger, something I'd forgotten existed in a place like this." Naomi paused, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. "Respect," she said simply. He met her eyes, and for the first time there was no guard in his expression. "Yes," he said. "Respect. I used to think it was the same thing. As control, turns out it's the opposite." As the meal went on, he asked her about the restaurant, how long she'd been there, what she wanted to do next. She answered in her measured way, telling him about her love for the craft, about how she had once considered becoming a sommelier, but had stayed because she liked being part of the whole room's rhythm. "I like the way a good service feels," she said, "like music. Everyone moving in their part, but toward the same thing." He listened without interrupting, which was in itself a kind of surprise. When dessert came, a lemon tart with broiled meringue, he pushed the plate toward her. "Share it," he said. She hesitated only a moment before accepting a fork from the side station, taking a single, meat bite. The tartness and sweetness together were bright enough to make her close her eyes for just a second. When she opened them, he was watching her, but not in judgment. "You don't take," he said. "You allow. That's rare." He left not long after, but before he did, he placed a sealed envelope on the table beside the check. "For you?" he said, standing. "Not a tip. Open it when you're alone." She waited until the rush had eased, until the last of the dinner crowd had thinned, before stepping onto the balcony under the night air and breaking the seal. Inside was a short handwritten note on heavy paper. "Naomi, respect isn't bought, it's earned. You've taught me that. I've made a donation in your name to a hospitality scholarship fund for staff who want to advance their craft. It should cover more than a few dreams." VK, for a long moment, she just stood there, the note in her hands. The city spread out below like a map she suddenly knew how to read. She wasn't smiling exactly, but there was a quiet warmth in her chest, a sense that something had been set right, even if it wasn't entirely clear yet what that meant for either of them. Inside, the last of the tables were being cleared, the hum of the dishwasher rising from the kitchen. Sophia caught Naomi's eye from across the room and tilted her head toward the host stand. There, affixed just below the restaurant's logo, was a new plaque. "Respect is the dress code." No one had made an announcement. The staff moved a little taller, their steps a little lighter. Miguel, polishing glasses at the bar, grinned. When he saw her looking, "Looks good on you," he said. She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket. "It's not just for me," she replied. As she left that night, the air had cleared, the rain-washed streets gleaming under the lamplight. She walked without hurry, her steps matching the quiet certainty inside her. The games, the tests, the long silences, all of it had led here, to this strange and unexpected territory where a man like Victor Kane could put down his weapons long enough to admit that respect, once given, could change the shape of a room. And Naomi Carter, who had refused to flinch, had made sure that change had a place to stay.